Welcome to our event on technology for participation, inclusion, and engagement in peace processes, which is organized by SaferGlobe. My name is Mekri, and I am the executive director of SaferGlobe, which is an independent Finnish peace and security think tank studying and developing tools to promote peace and security. Our approach is multidisciplinary, policy-oriented, and impact focus. And specifically, we are looking at the development and innovation aspects of RDI, or research development and innovation, to answer the question of how can we do peace better? How can we create mechanisms and tools that allow peacemakers to work better in very challenging situations? One of the themes that we have been thinking about quite a lot lately is the possibility of somehow enhancing inclusion, participation, and engagement through simple and relatively straightforward mechanisms. One of the challenges that we have seen is that there is no end to inclusion checklists and mechanisms that can be used to create inclusion, but often these mechanisms are quite difficult and cumbersome and take a lot of time to use, which means that if one is resource constrained and has a very limited amount of time and is working in a very difficult situation, there might be a temptation to not try to create inclusion at all. And so for this session, what we're thinking about is how can we ensure some kind of inclusion and some kind of participation. I am joined by phenomenally fantastic guests today. The first speaker will be Tuomas Paasonen, who is now showing up on my screen. He is a fellow SaferGlobe, but also a work culture engineer at Futurice, which is a large digital company. We also have, we're joined by Nour Atrissi, also who's the founder and CEO of Teens Who Code, and Mazen Jalal, who is the co-founder of Yemenis in Exile podcast. Welcome, Tuomas, Mazen, and Nour. So glad to have you here. First, First, I'll give the floor to Tuomas, who will give us a bit of a presentation. Then there will be questions by the speakers to Tuomas, and then we'll give each one of the speakers a time to speak and respond. We are also looking forward to quite a lot of audience participation. There is a Zoom chat, but I will also give a link to a Slido where you can both give your comments and your questions as well. Thank you very much, and over to you, Tuomas.
Thanks, and as first thing, I can't find the unmute. Now, I have a few slides, so let me know if you don't see them. Otherwise, I'll start. So I'm going to talk about coverage mapping, or in other words, the question about how do you know you have involved enough people. I think that for every one of us, or at least most people, this question comes up in different forms in their work life more or less often. As Maria mentioned, I'm a fellow on Peace Tech at SaferGlobe, and as my day work, I do work culture engineering at Futurice, which basically means I'm a HR specialist in kind of more common sense language. And that means that quite often I'm participating in different kind of development projects where we are changing how the company works, how the company is organized. And of course, in those situations, we want to include as many people as we can. But already with 600 people, that is quite impossible to have everybody's views and everybody's opinion, point of view to be included. So we need to find a way how to simplify the question somehow. And what we have done is try to get away from counting people, counting percentages, and simplifying company kind of into groups and seeing how it works. So this is in simplicity our approach. We make two lists of groups. First list is about groups that we assume might have a different point of view on the topic, whatever that topic is on the question. And in our context, that quite often means different competencies: software developers, designers, management, or internal roles like myself. And that's one dimension there. And then we do another dimension, which is demographics. Again, in our context, that usually means countries. We are present in Finland, Germany, and Sweden. It means seniority levels. So we don't usually talk about ages, but we talk about how senior people are, and other types of demographics that go into another dimension, which gives us a table of intersectional groups that then we consider that, okay, have we included somebody from each of these groups? Have we reached each of these groups? And do we have enough coverage for our from our employees? Now, reflecting this approach to conflict analysis or any larger question on a societal level anyways, the question is quite similar. Of course, the scale is a lot larger when you have hundreds of thousands or millions of people. But the question is very similar. You don't have resources to meet everybody. You don't have enough time to meet everybody and talk to everybody. So what is enough? And trying to find a number, how many you want to reach, is probably too hard. But trying to find the meaningful intersectional groups in the society, in the area, in the region, might be a bit more easier task to reach, easier approach to get forward in your project. So there's 4 steps in using this approach for a larger questions like conflict analysis. Is first, simplifying the question. Most likely trying to involve people with such a broad scope as conflict analysis is probably impossible, but either splitting the question into smaller ones or simplifying the question that you really want to get the involvement from will help you a lot, especially if you find it hard to define the groups that you want to define. Then defining the relevant attributes. What are the dimensions? Probably demographics, whatever that means, genders, ages, regions is probably one dimension. And then the other dimension, depending on the situation, depending on your question, what you want to find out, they might be religious groups, political groups, or whatever is relevant for your case. And then putting them into the table, getting those intersectional groups in the table, and then defining a method or a representative. How do you include those intersectional groups? So you might have this kind of a map looking a table that I have here in the example that is covering some kind of method on how these different groups have been reached, or you might have names of people to interview from those groups and kind of having some kind of mapping of the region of the people of that area. So maybe one thing to mention here is that this is definitely not a tool for perfect mapping of everything, but a tool to get you forward and kind of get you thinking on the question, finalizing the question, and getting some kind of mapping picture and forward if you are feeling overwhelmed of the situation that you don't know at all how much inclusion you have. And kind of getting started might be hard, but I recommend this double diamond thinking, which is quite common in design projects, especially, where you start off by mindstorming or brainstorming ideas and really getting the groups, a lot of groups in, not thinking too much about if they fit your need, if they fit your question perfectly, and then prioritizing the groups, pushing kind of small, choosing the groups that are important, you feel that they are justifiable to be involved in the question or in the research. Then ideating solutions on how to reach those groups. And again, really brainstorming, getting a lot of ideas, and finally selecting the best solution for each of the intersectional groups. So what you can use this table for is identifying or finding the groups that you haven't considered before. So you might end up finding that, hey, actually there's this and this segment that we haven't reached yet, and we don't know how they are considering our question. We don't know their point of view. You might be prioritizing the groups again with limited resources, where you put the effort, who you actually need to push to get their message through. You might be listing interviews from each of the groups, or you might be planning the use of different medias or tools to reach those groups. There's a whole lot of text on this slide, but maybe the main point is there on the left side. So if you are feeling uncertainty, are you feeling overwhelmed about the topic on how to get started from somewhere, start with a list of groups, start with a list of methods which you know. And I believe that the more you start walking with the tool, the more you find things that you can involve, things that you can have, and at least the things that we have found out when we have used this tool, either at Futurice or with SaferGlobe, we have noticed that the discussion is the thing that takes us forward, as long as we get started from somewhere. And if you want to try this out in your project, SaferGlobe is now looking an opportunity to test the tool in a real life case. We have had a couple of workshops and discussions on the tool, but we would love to find a partner who would really benefit about this kind of tool, from this tool in their project, and we would be very happy to hear about you. I think Maria might be the best contact if you have such a project there, but you can also contact me if you wish. So that's my coverage mapping table.
Thanks very much. Perhaps to add, what we're trying to do is actually a proper innovation process within the piece. So we have come up with an idea, a kind of a prototype, and now we would like to develop it further. But Nour and Mazen, I wonder if you would have some questions for Tuomas already at this time.
So I understand, if I understand correctly, this tool is yet to be tested?
Yeah, well, in this context, yes, this is kind of a basic tool that I use in my daily work, but of course, with a broader audience, we're looking for a real life test.
I'm curious to know, with your experience so far with your company, when you started using the tool, what has changed? What are the things that you have noticed, both from a culture perspective and the impact this diversity had on the business outcomes and day-to-day operations?
I think that quite often with especially HR processes, that the business outcome is a tad far away to say directly kind of how they affect them, which is a kind of bummer side of my work, in a sense that it's really hard to kind of draw lines. I think that what has changed inside the projects and in the daily work is that we have found quite a lot of these kind of groups that we didn't think about, because we kind of tend to go to the paths that we have custom with and kind of things that we have gotten used to. So talking with pretty much the same people, including same groups. So really putting names on the table, really putting kind of seeing names and seeing those intersectional groups has made me think or think more on who we are including for our internal projects. Who do we get enough different views? Do we get different views across the project, so that it is not all the time the same people in the project? So I think that this kind of a somewhat structured way of approaching the question gives kind of more diversity in who we are talking with.
Thank you.
To follow up on that, we tested it in Finland, and the topic was corona vaccinations in Finland, and how should we promote people taking corona vaccinations. And everyone involved in the workshop had a peace and security background, an international peace and security background, with very little additional knowledge of corona vaccinations in Finland beyond the newspapers, which is why we thought that it would be a very good kind of example, because whenever you start this kind of a process, you're never going to have perfect knowledge. But what was interesting was that when we started to begin with, everyone we could very quickly identify the groups where we knew how they would feel. So we knew, for example, that urban women were more likely to be corona vaccination positive. And then we thought, well, maybe rural men would be less likely, but then it quickly started disintegrating also in our discussion to these smaller groups that you can't kind of stereotype people, that you have to kind of drill down. Mazen, would you have a comment or a question?
I just have a question for Tuomas. So for projects that are trying to gather inclusion from like social media and audience, you know how like these big companies feed on polarization, and if that affects, you know, like this tool, and like, you know, this is a huge question in our work, like how like it's hard to fight these big companies, and I was wondering if this tool could help.
Well, I think you could use that. Now I'm kind of on the fly thinking on how that might be, but I guess that also what it is, if you follow social media just and see kind of what is trending there, you kind of get those polarized groups easily. So you if you just make simple statistics of what people are saying, what kind of opinions they have, you get very polarized views, and because that's how the platforms work. Maybe you could do this in a sense that before you actually start looking at what is happening at the social media, what kind of opinions there are, and looking for the statistics, rather than looking for numbers of how many people are voting for something or are talking about some specific point of view. Looking for examples or searching for example, having those intersectional groups first there, and then diving into Twitter, looking for example of people who represent somewhat. Of course, this is not perfect to find people who match perfectly in the boxes, but looking for people who match in those little boxes and kind of see what they are saying. If they're differing opinions in certain boxes, or is there really strong opinions in that box, and kind of this way. So maybe using that to direct your own research on the social media rather than kind of diving straight to the statistics that the platforms are giving.
Thank you, Tuomas. That makes sense.
Thank you very much. We got a question from the audience, but I'll keep that for the discussion. Nour, I give the floor over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Let me start by giving a quick introduction about myself and what I do. So my name is Nour Atrissi. I'm Lebanese, born, raised, based in Beirut, Lebanon. I'm currently in Istanbul working remotely because why not? But I'm based in Lebanon. And I've done multiple things throughout my career. I've done multiple shifts. But what would be most interesting to highlight, especially for this discussion, is my work for Teens Who Code, which is the startup company that I started in 2016 and ran up until the pandemic. My education is different. I was not involved in the tech industry since day one. I studied food science, and I worked in the food industry domain for a couple of years. I was going through the academic route, but then I decided to do a career shift, starting with digital marketing and then ending in the startup world. Basically, as the name implies, Teens Who Code, we wanted to teach teenagers how to code. And that was through a summer academy that takes place every year between July and August for full 4 weeks. It's a day camp where teenagers between the ages of 12 to 18 come over to the location. We do it at a locale called Beirut Digital District. It's like the Silicon Valley of Lebanon. It's a small place in Beirut, but how small the country is, it is considerably big. It's like 10 buildings that are located next to each other. And in those buildings are, of course, there's a community, the tech community, the digital community of Lebanon, and different companies of different sizes have their offices there. So it's a very immersive community experience where the kids come in and then choose the courses that we offer, just like as if they are at university. And those courses are what they most likely don't learn at school and what they need to thrive in a tech world, from game development, web development, cybersecurity, even public speaking, entrepreneurship, design. So there would be like a full list of offerings, and each student would choose his or her suitable courses. And then on top of the courses, there's also the sports activities, because we want to promote the physical well-being as important as the mental well-being. And because we noticed that as children grow up and become teenagers, they start, first of all, having maybe body insecurities, at least in my personal experience in my country. And then as you get older, you start prioritizing your career and your work and have less and less time for your own well-being. So we wanted to promote these two in parallel. And then in addition to the courses, to the sports, we also take them to tour the companies that are at the Beirut Digital District and a little bit outside, to see the startups, the corporates, the scale-ups, all different types of companies and investors, incubators, the kind of work that awaits them, what kind of careers they could have once they graduate from university, because there's also this gap between what they're learning and what the market wants, and this kind of orientation in Lebanon, in the Middle East, I believe as well, where the imagination of what's out there is completely different than what it actually is. And we still have the mentality that lawyers, doctors, engineers, that these are the professions, the best ones, that's what you should do. And now we have an oversaturation of that. And then there are lots of millions of tech vacancies all around the world that are not being filled. So we do this in addition to a startup competition. So just like you see, the purpose of this summer camp is to actually provide a foundation to all of the skills anybody would need in order to thrive in this tech world. And how does this link to peace and to inclusion? So I understand that for things to start being effective, doing simple steps would be much better than having this like perfect plan and starting from the very beginning that we might never live to see the result of. However, for me, I would like to start a little bit earlier and start targeting the younger generation, because I believe that if somebody got the skills to be able to be whatever they want in the tech industry, this by itself is a very, very strong tool that democratizes the access to opportunities. And once you have that skill, and companies recruit based on skill, regardless of where the person is coming from, how they look like, what their beliefs are, the mere fact that you have the skill to compete with everybody else will by itself lead to inclusion. And I will share a personal example about myself and what I'm currently doing. So I was doing this camp up until the pandemic, and obviously it's an in-person experience, and because of COVID, we just can't do it anymore. So for the time being, I'm working as a freelance project manager in education technology. And I've been working with, I worked with a company for the past year, and now I'm working with a different company. And both of these companies are not in Lebanon, are not in the Middle East. And I happen to have access to them through my skill set. And the current environment that I'm working with is completely diverse, completely international. And if I was, I was not recruited because I don't really like to label myself, but for the sake of the conversation, I was not recruited because I was a female, because I was hijabi, because I was Muslim, because I was from the Middle East, because I was from an underprivileged third country. I was recruited because I had the skill set that would make the project work. And that is exactly what I was trying to do with Teens Who Code, is to empower the people to have what it takes to be chosen regardless of their background.
Thank you very much, Nour, for that introduction. Mazen, perhaps you would have a question for Nour, and then I'll ask.
Yeah, I think what Nour is doing is really amazing. Personally, like with the project we're doing, we realized when we reached a certain point that there are like steps we should have taken first. And when Nour said that she wanted to start from like the base, I really reflected to that, and I think it's really amazing.
Thank you.
I'm really sorry. I don't know. It's like what if like I'm just like thinking now. You're saying you're trying to qualify like those, helping them have the skill set to be included. And I'm thinking, does that contradict with the idea of we should include everyone, and like regardless of like, you know, like you said you were included regardless of your hijab and all these things, and maybe in the like these are like current thoughts, like random ones, but I don't know. Does it feed the idea of only including if you have skill set? I don't know. What do you think on this?
To me, this might sound a little bit contradictory to what the conversation, where the conversation is going. But to me, I'd rather recruit solely on skill set. If that leads to a group of people who are homogeneous, then be it. If it's diverse, then be it. But if somebody chooses me because of my background, I ask myself, is this taking away the chance from somebody else who is maybe equally qualified, but then we're not leaving it up to the universe to take its natural course to where each person would be placed. This works to my advantage. What's going on all around the world, I feel like now if I apply to Harvard, chances of me getting in would be much higher than if I had applied 20 years ago. So this is good for me in my case, but I'm thinking about this, applying this to everybody. Like, do I really want to be labeled? I don't think I'm comfortable with that. I wish we can get to a point where companies that are recruiting don't have face-to-face interviews, maybe would mask the voice of the person, would never see how they look like, would never know anything about their background, make the hiring decision. I'm very curious to see who would make it. Because as much as we are trying to make software that is unbiased, there's always the human element that is involved in the decision making. And no matter how neutral we try to be, we're always going to process the prejudgment that we have about other people, where they come from, how they look like, their nationality, etc. And I don't know if as human beings we have the capacity of unlearning what we know.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're saying like the skill set is a fair way to choose people. Yeah, makes sense.
How I see it.
Tuomas, I wonder if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, super interesting. First of all, your project is super interesting, and I really love what you're doing. We have our company has done something similar in a very small scale compared to your project, and I kind of really like to hear it. And as a comment before my questions, I really kind of also like that you are involving the companies and I'm kind of promoting different things about work life, and not just the hard skills of coding or technology, but having the whole package, which is something that also I try to do whenever I talk with young people in my work. So kind of showing that the work life is so much more than just the hard skills. Although the discussion now and really kind of hitting my heart as well, because I've been doing a lot of recruitment and struggling with these questions every day of kind of what are we considering when we are doing recruitment, and that's a whole topic that I think I could spend a whole day talking about, and kind of how to overcome that as you mentioned, things that we have learned. I think that you put it really well. Kind of continuing from that, I would like to hear a bit on how the companies have taken your project. How are there kind of certain type of companies that have wanted to be involved in your project, or kind of what kind of feedback have you gotten from them?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, this has unfolded very positively without even us having to plan it. Basically, when the kids are like immersed in this community space, where I know that being in a community has so many benefits that you cannot necessarily point out at the beginning, but you know that lots of doors are going to open up if you're actually involved with other people doing different things. And the first summer camp was in 2016. And then in that year, one of the students was going down the stairs. So we had a class at the rooftop in one of the event spaces that we had, and he was going down the stairs. And then a guy comes out from one of the floors where his company is, and he stops them, and they're like, what are you doing here? I mean, you're 13, you're 14. What are you doing at the Digital District? So they explained to him, like, we're from Teens Who Code. We come here, we learn how to code, etc., etc. And he asked, is any of you a developer? So the student, his name was Wissam, he says yes. And he was, I think, 15 at the time. He was in his first year in high school. He's like, okay, come to my office. So he came, he was interested in hiring him as an intern. And then Wissam came to me and told me what happened. I was like, wow, I never thought we would get there so quickly. I thought it's gonna like take years. Was already learning how to code by himself for a year prior to joining Teens Who Code. So he was decent at what he was doing. He was not just somebody who would learn from the company, he would also add a little bit of value. And for a company who has a lot of repetitive work, especially in development, you know this more than I do, it would make a lot of sense to have an intern do that rather than the highly paid engineers. And for Wissam, it was a huge learning experience, like coming to the office every day, seeing all of those people, etc. And that made me spot a huge opportunity. And then we created the internship program right after this. So every year I would talk to partner companies. I would say like, hey, are you interested in having our good students, like who can actually add value to the company into your program? And we've done this with like 10 or 12 companies, and people were placed either in technical roles or marketing roles. One student who used to come all the way from outside Beirut, and Beirut is the capital, and usually in a country like Lebanon, most opportunities are in the capital. So he used to come from like a city that would take him an hour drive just to attend this camp. And the same happened. So we were in we were visiting a game development company, and he happened to be one of the gamers of that particular company, and he didn't even know that they were placed in Lebanon. He thought that, I don't know, they were like somewhere else in the world. It's an Arab game development company. They do games in Arabic, and he was an avid user. He was so passionate about it. He spoke to the CEO, and then the CEO really loved his passion and the amount of knowledge he had, because he's been playing their games for years, gave him an advantage. And then he hired him to be in the customer support team. So he did this for part-time for 2 years. And then once he graduated from school, he became a full-timer. And then he was studying economics at the university in parallel at the same time. This is a concrete example of how having the skill and the access would actually democratize the access to opportunities, because this kid would have never landed what he did hadn't he been exposed, and also having the skill that it takes for him to do what he does. So I'm happy that some companies, there are few, we can count them by hand, but the plan was to actually apply this at a much larger scale, so that every student who goes through Teens Who Code will be actually employed or have an internship in a company And from there, the rest would be history. I believe that the course of their life will be completely changed once they go through this experience.
Super interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nour, for sharing your experience. I think it's very interesting that you say what you say about inclusion, because there's an interesting kind of contradiction in that you have done so much to enable youth to get these kind of jobs through the skill sets. So it's interesting to me that that you're doing so much for inclusion, but at the same time, I fully understand that being able to be kind of neutral, so that it is really your skill set that matters, is also very important. That there are more questions in the chat, but before them, I will give the floor over to Mazen.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Tuomas. Thank you, Nour. So for the for those who don't know, Mazen Jalal, obviously you know that. So I'm a co-founder of the Yemenis in Exile podcast. It's a podcast in which we give space for Yemenis to tell their own stories of pain and struggle in order to make an emotional connection between people in the midst of political chaos. And we use these stories to entice like emotions toward the war in Yemen, regardless of what political opinion you have, changing the idea of a winner and a loser as an outcome of the war to what it really is, which is like a loser and another loser. Especially in the current stage of war in Yemen, media outlets are tending to share what they call victories, ignoring the horrible outcomes of war. And we try to show that via letting people tell their own stories and use that to build through to build peace through understanding each other's pain. Inclusion in the podcast is it allows people to have like discussions and be the center of these discussions. The current way of discussion is centered around political aspects. In the beginning, we were worried that what if people don't feel like talking about their feelings? What if others feel like it's boring compared to heated discussions about war? However, as soon as we started recording and sharing the stories, we realized people are finding an element that they have been missing, because in the political stage, politicians are included in the political process, and because of war, that affects not only politics but all aspects of life in Yemen. And people are affected by the political decisions only have the choice of like engaging with whatever happens around them. But the podcast makes their feelings and their needs the center of the discussion about like war. And I remember in one of the episodes we interviewed an extremist, and I was worried that he would bring up what like his beliefs, and that's okay, but like that would disturb what we're trying to do. I was worried that he would bring like his opinions up, but as soon as we started the interview and we asked him like how he felt, going through what he went through, he never stopped talking about his feelings and his needs, and how he wants the future of Yemen to be. And he never mentioned like any political opinion or any political side, because we realized people have been asked many times about like their political opinion, but like no one has asked them about what they need or how they feel towards the war.
Mazen, don't stop there. Tell us how they feel and what they need.
Oh, um, we because like what we're trying to do is like making connections between many different political opinions. We realize like people like, okay, let's say a person has an opinion of I want the country to be secular. Now for religious people, that's a hard concept. Like they're, for them it's refused. But when this opinion is like changed into, it's the same opinion, but what he really wants is to live in a country where where he can have whatever opinion he has. And when he has that, when the statement is like that, a lot of people would um, get that. They would feel like they would have common grounds, that would be that common grounds that we all have as like humans. And an interesting thing, through the project, we decided to ignore the politicized stories that obviously put the blame of like for the horrible things which happened in the story on one side. And most of the time that's the case. But so like the initial decision was to ignore these stories and look for neutral stories. But then we realized how these stories are used by the media out there, in a way that deepens the conflict and endangers the people in the story. We decided to focus on such stories in order to set an example for people, as well as like media outlets, of how these stories can be used for peace, how these stories are really a result of war that's been going on, and also to set an example for like political powers that tend to only recognize the two options. You either ignore these stories, or you use them politically, uh, choosing to ignore that there is an option of using these stories to build peace. Yeah, that tells most of like the inclusion related aspects in the podcast.
Thanks very much, Mazen. Now, Tuomas, I look towards you and actually Nour as well for some questions if you have any.
Yeah, I think that kind of, when you said that you give the people an opportunity to be heard, which I think is the kindest thing to do in the world that you can do for another person, is to give them the opportunity. So absolutely great approach to your podcast. And I was wondering kind of, quite a lot of people, and I know kind of might feel like you said that you were worried if they want to talk about their emotions and feelings and how they approach things. So how do you find the people to share who share their stories? How do you kind of collect those stories?
We obviously have like rules, but besides that, it was really easy finding stories of struggle. One of the stories we interviewed on the podcast is of a person in the team, in the project, who had to travel like from a country to another because of war. He was a journalist. But the one rule we have is that the person who comes in needs to really believe in the opinion he holds, because a lot of people would pretend to have opinions for because that's the way they make money, or that's how that society enforced them to have these certain opinions. That disturbs like the discussion. But we like doing the first stories, we feel like it's really easy to find stories. It was hard to find diverse stories. So like after the first story on a journalist, we found a lot of journalists who would love to share their stories. but then we couldn't do that because it would be like similar story. So we had to go to like a student, and then like a filmmaker, and then in my context it's easy to find like stories.
And Nour, if you don't mind, I'll jump in with a question. One of the things that I find interesting and also really challenging is often when you meet people who have been involved in conflict. Well, the people who have been involved in conflict are multi-dimensional. So there is this push and pull to create goodies and baddies, but even very bad people can actually be kind of good as well. For me personally, a really kind of interesting meeting was with an IRA former terrorist who was kind of like an Irish Santa Claus and had worked had been a social worker in his community in Belfast, and who at the same time as he was very keen on promoting the welfare of his community, also said that he would still make the bombs he had made that had killed civilians. And somehow combining these two at the same time, someone who, well, is like Irish Santa Claus, and then at the same time is willing to kill civilians. It's just quite difficult in one's brain, and also possibly quite difficult in the podcast, because you need to create, you somehow have to show both sides at the same time. How do you do that?
Well, the political discussion in Yemen is very it's like there are like only three sides, and like whenever, okay, so I can identify which side that person is from by his name, like his family name, and it was like it was like repetitive to address in the beginning. Now, like I want to say that we realized that's a mistake. We decided not to address the political aspect of these stories, or like the dangerous aspect of these stories, and we decided to do that because we didn't have, or we still don't have any like political experience, or like any political degree. But we realized that's a mistake because people still understand those things. It's not there, these things are not hidden. But our podcast's job is to show the like the good side, the common ground between like all of us. Because if you go to the media's already said all the horrible things about this person, whereas we're trying to find what's common. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thanks very much, Mazen. And Nour, would you have a question before we open the floor?
Not a question, I just have a comment. I think what you're doing, Mazen, is very honorable, just for dedicating the time to hear how people feel, especially at a context as large as war across a whole country. And if I were to think about cases in my personal life where I'm applying this at a very, very small scale, so most of the conflicts that I managed to resolve with my family or my friends or at work, half of it would be gone if just people say how they feel and share how they feel. So I believe, although maybe the war can be something outside of your control, but getting people to talk is maybe a step towards solving the problem. This is from one side. On another side, just listening to how people feel is very, I imagine, is very mentally and emotionally taxing. And this is why it's honorable that you're still going with this, you and your team. And if any of you follows up with international news, you of course have heard about the Beirut port explosion last August in 2020, which is the second closest thing to a nuclear explosion throughout history, which happened to be very close to where I work and where I live. Gladly, I was not at the office and I was not physically harmed, but it's been 9 months now. And every time, no one has asked me how I feel yet. And I'd rather no one does, because the moment I think about how I feel, I immediately like burst out into tears. And that's, it's not even a war, you know, it was a one-time incident. I wasn't even there. And listening to how people feel about something that has disrupted all of their life, I can only imagine how tough that is. And I commend you for your strength.
Thanks, Nour. That's really an important aspect. When working on these stories, we realized, like, our team, we tend to make a lot of jokes, but then we like, and it would disturb like the workflow. But then we realized this is like our coping mechanism with all the like the horrible stories we read. And you know, I think for teams working on peace building, they need to address this aspect of like peace within themselves before they you know, can implement it on like other people or projects. Thank you.
I now invite the audience. We have both the Slido and then we have the chat here, and I feel kind of bad going back, but I will now go back to the questions that were asked. There are two by Gabor Farkas, and perhaps for the first one, I will actually start the answer and then invite Tuomas to fill in. But the question is, what was the COVID vaccination based on, and have you found a way to define which information contributed to individuals' decisions not to be vaccinated in this COVID study that we used? The reason why we used the COVID study was that typically in peace processes, what we want to do is we want to start with an awful lot of desk study on the situation, so that we would understand the situation the best we possibly could. But sometimes that's the study is time consuming and everything changes as you study things. So with this tool, we've been thinking about the innovation cycle. So how can you cyclically develop something, start from somewhere, develop something? But what we very quickly found was that the way that the media in Finland has been very stereotypical in the way that it has talked about people who want to take COVID vaccinations and who don't. There seems to be a grouping of right-wing young rural males on the one hand, and on the other hand, better educated urban females. So these kind of, and then as we were using the tool, we were finding all different kinds of groups, which we actually don't really know much about. And if we were taking the tool forward, then what was really interesting was where we had very little information. So we were one of the questions that we found out was that we, for example, knew very little about how family size affected eagerness to get the COVID vaccination. Especially, I mean, if there are children involved, does that mean that parents want to get it? Or if there are more children, you know, this kind of questions, they really haven't been discussed. Tuomas, would you have more points to add?
No, I think you covered quite well. So I think that some of those aspects did raise up in the discussion on what we thought about, and actually maybe it even directed the discussion towards the end of the workshop, that from the very obvious things like the rural young right-wing men to kind of more of these questions on whether people have close ones who have gone through COVID or something like that. So how those kind of more under the radar kind of things are affecting people's opinions.
And maybe just to add to that, it seems like participation is maybe easiest in this kind of mid-gray scale. So you have the people who would want to participate, and then you have the people who are kind of on the fence. But when we only know about the people who would participate and who would not participate, then actually what we're missing are the people who are on the fence, who we might be able to impact most. And I think that was quite interesting. Okay, I'm looking to see if there are other questions, but then I think the next question is, Nour, maybe you can take this first. And then Tuomas, so you can fill it. Can you see it in the chat?
In the chat, if you're in a vacuum?
Yes.
Yeah, so if you are in a vacuum and have no bias whatsoever, should the decision of hiring or choosing someone be left to the outcome of a coin flip when candidates appear to have equal skill sets? I believe so. Let the universe take its course.
And Tuomas, you're actually doing this. You're recruiting. What do you think about that?
I'm in a very, very lucky position to be in an industry that is hiring a lot of people. So if we have 2 qualified people, we welcome them both. So there's no question about that. But sure, if there would be one position to fill, then an opportunity to only hire one, they are completely equal. It is quite often, it feels like flipping a coin, to be honest, in the real life as well.
I think, I mean, I recruit as well, and I must say that I have never been in a situation, and of course the recruiting we do is on a smaller scale, but I have never been in a situation where we would have had 2 equal candidates. That the skill sets possibly yes, but then when you look at additional skill sets or communication skills or team skills or other skills that we are missing within the working environment, then I'm struck by how different people are. And so often the challenge is that you have 2 or more people who are fantastic in their own way, but not in the same way. So you can't have a kind of coin toss, but what then at least I've had to do is a kind of strategic analysis of which is now more important for the organization. Is it more important that there's someone who knows how to use social media really well, or is it more important to have someone who has a stronger academic background, which at this point is, and those I think are pretty typical questions. I would assume. I'm looking for someone to comment. Maybe someone in the audience also does recruiting. Okay. But Nour, you have also done applications for all of these teams through code. How do you select the candidates for the camps?
So there are 2 types of recruiting. There's the students themselves, which is, I wouldn't classify as pure recruiting because Teens Who Code is a company. It's not an NGO. So people eventually have to have the means to pay for the summer camp. So that's that. People have to be interested. And then the selection would be, we don't have any criteria, like they don't have to have any certain level of academic or technical skill. It's literally open to anybody who wants to learn. But I've done recruiting for my team because every summer the operational team changes. We've got team leaders, people doing social media. So there's like at least 15 people changing every year. And it's really hard. Once I was also, the temporary people, it's easier to make a decision than the full-time people. When I was recruiting a full-time team, I made a decision that I'm never doing recruiting myself. I'm gonna have to hire a third-party recruiting company to do this because I couldn't get rid of my bias at all. This is relating to the bias discussion that we had, but also to build up on what you said, Maria, maybe it is quite often feasible to have two people with the same exact skill set, if we can classify them as hard skills. But then if you want to look at the bigger picture, like you said, the soft skills is what makes the difference. And I believe that there are no people with the exact same skill set of soft skills. It's like a personality, like a fingerprint, because everybody has had their own path, which made them what they are, the way they communicate, they think, they strategize, regardless of the degrees that they have had. And that is basically what would be able to make the difference. I adopt the same method as you. Like, what is most critical for the company right now? Do I want someone who can take the lead, or do I want someone who's like really good at what they do, because that other part is covered in the company? So usually it's a combination of both, and there's always somebody more suitable than the other from an overall perspective.
Excellent, thank you. Now, the audience question in the Slido is how best could inclusion be strengthened in practice? But our audience has clearly had enough of polls, and so I think I'll ask this question from the speakers, and then unless there are other questions from the audience, then we will say goodbye and thank you. Mazen, in your experience, how best could inclusion be strengthened in practice?
I would say creating space for this inclusion, because whenever there's a this world, like not this world, like I mean, like in this context is very chaotic. So it's hard for a person to be included, like an ordinary person. So I would say, and this is one of the things we realized we should have done before starting the project. But then like this space would be controlled by like political powers or media outlets. And then I know this doesn't answer the question, but like raises like more questions. But this is something I've been struggling with. Should it be like a space which can be like manipulated, or maybe it's like a framework of steps if you want to be included, or if you want to be included, if you want to be part of like a certain things in a good way. Like if you want to be like a peace builder instead of a space for peace builders, it should be like a framework for peace builders. So I know that's not an answer, but like those are like my thoughts.
Thanks, Mazen. I think one of the challenges in peace building often is how much are you creating something new, and how much are you discovering and rediscovering and retelling things from the past, because somehow the situation must be developed, it must change into something new, but it can't change into something new without having clear understanding of what's happened in the past. And then there's the whole question of how much does change happen and how much do you drive change? And if you drive change, can you change it? Can you drive it so much that you kind of break change in a way? So I didn't help you at all there. I just asked more questions, but I think these are very pertinent central questions to ask. Nour, what would you say about inclusion?
So now that we're having this discussion, I'm starting to see peace building as very overlapping areas, since conflict or the destabilization of peace would mainly stem from the differences among people. And once we close those gaps or try to narrow them as much as possible, chances of peace, having peace around, is going to be much higher. And then how do we do the inclusion part in parallel? For me, I know that my approach is a little bit long term, but I also believe that first closing the gap, which is the capacity building that I spoke about earlier, but also promoting environments that already have inclusion in them. And here I'm curious to know how Tuomas gets to, how do you get to your inclusion goals or quota? Do you simply choose among the pool of candidates that have applied to the jobs that you have vacancies in your company, or do you actually go and headhunt and reach out to people with specific backgrounds so that you could fulfill this diversity?
A good question. As mentioned, we don't well, first of all, we don't hire usually for individual seats. So as mentioned, we kind of look for everybody as individuals and consider them as individuals. So we hire all the people who are qualified and kind of, you know, in that kind of sense, looking just for the applicant pool isn't enough to get diversity or diversity in a sense, yes, but if we want to kind of change the way we behave, and then we have a lot of diversity and inclusion goals in our actions, and that has been a big question for us in few past years on how do we increase diversity, how do we increase especially inclusion, and how do we make Future as a place where people feel more included. And we do all kind of stuff. In fact, we first of all, we promote the goals that we have, just so people are aware that, hey, we are looking for you. We are looking for people with different backgrounds, and we're kind of, we want to hear your opinions, how we can make our company better for you. We participate in a lot of events or projects where we promote, especially in our field. It's a very there's a lot of men compared to women in our field, and we tend to participate in projects that promote, especially for young women and girls, coding and be there to get more people to the field in general, but also more diverse people to the field. So there's all kind of these kind of things that we do that are maybe aimed more to change the industry, because the candidate pool at the moment is very homogeneous in a sense. So we want to broaden the whole industry and not just look at what we are hiring, because that wouldn't be enough to gain the diversity.
Yeah, thank you, Tuomas, for answering my question. And from what you're saying, this is, and also if I'm looking at it from a business perspective, that's a huge cost for the company to actually try to be inclusive, from human resources and time consuming. Like a third party should be taking care of all of the promotion, maybe government or NGOs, and to actually promote the places that already have inclusion, to make it easier for companies like Tuomas's to actually have the people at their door instead of them going and reaching out to them. And I'll give a very simple example, which is something that we try to do as well, is when we do our videos and photos on social media, I always try, although the ratio of guys to girls is like super, there's a big discrepancy. Boys are always a lot more than girls in our tech camps, but we always try to show that there are boys and there are girls, so that whenever a mom or a dad or a girl sees the advertisement, would never think that this is just for boys. And we noticed that over the years, our percentage of girls went up to 25%. Versus maybe 5% at the very beginning, without us having to explicitly make a special track for girls or women or whatever. It's simply by showing that this environment is for everybody. And if this is also showcased in companies, in events, in any kind of environment that needs to have inclusion in it, especially in the media, and somebody out there making sure that this is entering every household, whether on TV or on social media, that would get us, I believe, to half our goal. And then it will be the responsibility of the companies who is doing the hiring to actually choose from this pool that is already somehow diverse. That's how I would approach inclusion.
Thank you very much. Now we are running out of time, so I would like to thank all the participants and all the speakers. Thank you so much. I think this discussion is one that we will need to continue for years to come, because the questions of inclusion are kind of chicken and egg, that you know, we need to promote skill sets, and then we have to enable people to participate, and then we have to figure out mechanisms that allow for people to participate, and especially in situations which are challenging. Thank you so much to everyone, and I hope that you have a great time with the rest of the